Sleet flashed under our lights as Rook, my aging Malinois, stepped ahead of me and locked onto a young buck swaying in the lane with a tyre around its neck. Traffic was stopped. The police SUV strobed red and blue, and my dog's stubborn calm carried the risk his stiff legs could no longer hide. I stood behind him, afraid that one wrong second would take the deer or the partner who never quit on me. To understand why he held that line, we have to return to porch mornings before the rumour turned urgent. On the morning I first wondered if Rook was losing his edge. The porch boards were still damp with dew, and the maples were turning a slow, polite gold along our quiet street. I was pouring coffee when my radio crackled with a call about a deer lingering near County Road 6. Rook didn't bark or spin in circles. He just paced a careful line from the door to my boots, as if the whole day were tilted slightly off level and waiting for me to notice. At the Maple Ridge station, the shift was routine on paper traffic detail, a welfare check on an elderly couple. The kind of quiet work towns like ours depend on. Yet Rook kept circling the gear rack, nose hovering over the wildlife control kit we rarely used. I told myself he was bored. Then I told myself I was projecting. He was 12, and I was 63. We both had reasons to watch the calendar too closely and pretend it didn't matter. The dispatcher left a note on my desk in neat block letters. Another caller says they saw the tyre buck. I read it twice, then let out a laugh that sounded thinner than I meant. That story had floated around Maple Ridge for years, like a campfire tale that wouldn't die, passed from hunters to school bus drivers. Rook pressed his muzzle against the paper and inhaled, as if the ink itself carried a trail only he could read. After lunch, I drove the perimeter by the old sawmill, where the river bends and the air always smells faintly of resin. A light wind carried pine, diesel, and cold water. Rook sat rigid in the passenger seat, ears forward. When we passed the turnoff to the state forest, he whined once soft, contained. I kept driving, reminding myself we had no jurisdiction out there and no time for folklore on a Tuesday, even if my gut felt less certain. Back at home that evening, my neighbour Anne stopped by with a jar of peach preserves and a worried look that made her seem older than she is. She said her grandson had nearly hit a deer at dawn, and the animal had something around its neck. The word something landed heavy. Rook nudged my hand, then walked to the window and stared into the thinning light like he was listening to footsteps I couldn't hear in the trees beyond our fences. I pulled up the county incident log. 2 calls in a week about a deer on the same stretch of road, both near the green mile marker where kids used to count hawks on field trips. No photos. No injuries. I typed a brief advisory and almost closed the file. Rook lay at my feet, but his tail kept tapping in steady beats that matched my pulse. I wondered if he was chasing a ghost, or if I was failing to see a simple truth. It felt like the start of a clock. That night, a light rain began. whispering against the gutters and turning the gravel drive into a soft hiss under tyres. I heard Rook moving in the hallway, nails clicking, then stopping. When I opened my bedroom door, he was sitting beside my uniform jacket. He looked at me with that patient insistence he'd used on missing person searches, the kind that made you doubt your own excuses and reconsider last week's priorities. Before sleep, my phone buzzed with a local news alert. Mysterious tyre buck reported again near Maple Ridge. I set the device face down, pretending it was nothing but clickbait. Rook rested his chin on my knee, warm and steady. The question I didn't ask out loud was simple and unsettling. What if the rumour was a real animal running out of time? And what if my dog already knew it better than any of us in uniform tonight? Wednesday brought a clear sky and a third call. A mail carrier said a large buck had been seen drinking from a roadside ditch. Its head tilted at an odd angle, as if the weight on his neck had become part of his gait. The description ended with the same 2 words: rubber tyre. I felt my stomach tighten. Rook was already at the cruiser, tail low, ready in the way he got when he believed the work still mattered. His eyes, the carrier said, looked tired. I tried to treat it like any other report. I phoned the county wildlife office and left a polite message. Their voicemail warned of staffing shortages and a 48-hour response window. I looked at my watch and heard myself sigh. Rook listened to my side of the conversation, then let out a short huff and nudged the passenger door with his nose. Impatient with bureaucracy in a way I rarely allowed myself to be. I promised a follow-up I wasn't sure they could meet. In the afternoon, the local paper posted a grainy photo online. You could just make out antlers and the dark arc of a small tyre around a thick neck. The caption said the deer had been spotted for nearly 2 years. Always farther north. Always just out of reach. At roll call, 2 younger officers joked about viral fame. Rook stood beside my chair and stared at the screen as if it were a live feed and he could will it closer. I walked Rook behind the station where the grass meets the baseball field and the sound of Little League practice drifts on summer evenings. I threw a ball twice to test his mood. He fetched it and dropped it, then turned his head toward the distant trees and held still. I tried the easy explanation aging dog. Stiff joints. Distraction. Then I heard myself repeat it a second time, as if saying it twice could make it true. That evening a cold front arrived early, sharpening the air and pulling fog up from the river. Anne called to say her church group wanted to organise a tyre buck watch for safety along the road. The idea of elderly volunteers standing near traffic made me uneasy. Rook paced the kitchen, then stopped at the drawer where I keep old search maps, tapping it with one firm paw like a gentle order, then looking back to see if I understood. When I finally reached Officer Elena Reyes, our town's wildlife liaison, she said the state had records of the deer going back 2 full years. sightings on a hunting forum, a few half-hearted attempts with tranquilizer darts, and one video of the buck limping through snow with the tyre still in place. "He keeps slipping away," she said. Rook lifted his head at her voice through the speaker, as if the timeline had snapped into focus for him. By Friday, the story had migrated to local radio. A host asked whether Maple Ridge police were too soft to help one suffering animal. It was unfair, but it stung. I drafted a measured reply and promised coordination with the state before the weekend. Rook pressed his shoulder into my leg in the office. A steady, wordless reminder that he was not interested in reputation, only outcome on the road and in the woods. I could feel the town watching us in that quiet way. I drove out at dusk to the edge of the forest road where the sightings clustered. The light was honeyed, and the asphalt still held warmth from the day. Rook stepped out, sniffed, and then froze, staring into the trees with a focus that felt almost personal. The high-concept truth settled in me at last. My near-retirement K9 had chosen this wild, forgotten deer, and he would not let me walk away. If he failed, so would I. I met Rook on a damp training field 11 years ago. A lean Belgian Malinois with a chipped tooth and a stare that could lock onto a moving leaf. The state K9 coordinator handed me his file and said, "Hess smart, but he doesn't forgive half effort." I signed the transfer papers in the back of my cruiser, feeling too old for a new partner and too stubborn to admit it to anyone but myself. That day he chose me as much as I chose him. Our first winter together taught us humility. A blizzard shut down the interstate, and a tractor-trailer jackknifed near the ridge. Rook and I worked the snowbanks by headlamp, finding a teenager who had wandered from his car in panic. The boy's mother later mailed a letter with a photo and shaky handwriting. I kept it in my desk, and Rook would occasionally nose the drawer as if checking that memory was still there. By year 3, Rook had a reputation for refusing to quit. During a spring flood, he swam a narrow channel to reach a stranded family on a porch roof. The county commissioner shook my hand in front of a small crowd at the firehouse, and a local camera caught Rook shaking river water onto my boots. He tolerated the applause, then went straight to the donated towels, sniffing for the scent of water and work rather than praise. Not every mark he carried was a medal. One night, we responded to a barn fire outside town. The flames were contained, but the smoke was thick and the floorboards felt like drumheads beneath my feet. Rook pulled hard toward the stalls and helped us locate 2 calves left behind. Hours later, at the vet clinic, the tech told me his lungs were irritated and he needed rest. Rook slept with his head in my lap all the way home. The following summer, a reckless driver clipped our unit on a rural stop. The impact was minor for me, but Rook's rear leg took the brunt. The X-ray showed a clean fracture and a long recovery. I brought him home with a cast and a stack of rehab instructions. Anne dropped off casseroles, and my daughter called nightly. Rook learned to hop to the porch and still act as if he was guarding the whole county alone. The calendar on my fridge became our shared scoreboard. Rehab turned into quiet companionship. We walked slow laps around the lake at dawn, the kind of pace that lets you hear geese settle and boats creak against wooden docks. A retired game warden named Cal joined us occasionally and told stories about animals tangled in fence wire and fishing line. He said the worst suffering was the kind no one witnessed. Rook would glance toward the woods when Cal said that, as if filing it away. When Rook returned to duty, my captain suggested I start thinking about my own retirement. I bristled, then laughed it off in the hallway. The job had been my spine since I was 22. Rook seemed to sense the conversation's edge. He started sleeping closer to the front door, and he would lift his head at every night call, eager and a little anxious, like he was measuring our remaining usable time together. I pretended it was just prudence. 2 years ago, we were assigned to assist the state on a lost hiker case in the same forest that borders County Road 6. We never found the hiker alive, but we did recover his pack near a creek and a wedding ring in the mud that had to be handed back to his wife. The search left a weight on me that I rarely spoke about. Rook, however, returned to that area twice on routine patrols, nose low, as if unfinished threads still mattered. After that case, I began taking lighter shifts. I told my daughter it was for my knees. The truth was, I was trying to ease Rook into the idea of slowing down without breaking his spirit. We attended a small canine wellness evaluation where the vet noted mild arthritis and excellent heart function. I heard the word mild and clung to it. Rook heard my relief and wagged, pleased to have passed another test. I tucked the report into my wallet, so when the tire buck began showing up in new reports, my memory of Cal's warning and the forest search braided together. Rook's fixation didn't feel like a whim. It felt like the culmination of every hard season that had taught him compassion without sentimentality. We were stuck with this puzzle now, not because of pride, but because walking away would betray the very partnership that had kept us both upright for a decade. The next Monday, Elena Reyes arrived at our station with a clipboard, a soft-spoken confidence, and a tranquilizer kit that looked too small for a creature we couldn't even keep in frame. She brought fresh maps of the state forest and a list of sighting times gathered from social media and dispatch logs. Rook greeted her politely, then ignored her pockets and went straight to the maps, nose tracing the route that paralleled County Road 6 as if he already knew the story. Elena suggested a joint operation with the state wildlife vet, but she warned that the buck had likely learned to avoid vehicles, people, and anything that looked like help. We may get one clean chance, she said. As she spoke, an email alert chimed on her phone. Another sighting that morning. closer to town than before. Rook's ears flicked at the sound, and he rose to stand beside me, as if every notification were a starting pistol. I tried to control my expectations. We planned a low-profile stakeout with 2 cruisers and 1 unmarked truck. No sirens unless the deer entered traffic. The mayor's office asked for a brief safety update before the weekend farmers market. The request sounded like politics, but I knew it was worry dressed in formality. Rook waited by the garage door during the meeting, shifting his weight with the kind of patience that is actually restraint. On Wednesday, we practiced a gentle containment drill in the empty high school parking lot. I had Rook heel, sit, and hold position at increasing distances. The same obedience work we used for fairs and parades. He executed every command, but his eyes kept searching the tree line for movement that wasn't there. Elena watched quietly and said, "He thinks this is personal." Tom. I felt the truth of it settle behind my ribs. That afternoon, I received a call from Cal, the retired warden. He said a hunter had found bits of rubber along a shallow creek near the forest road, likely scraped off by antlers or bark. Cal offered to guide us to the spot at first light and reminded me to bring extra blankets for the sedated animal. Rook heard Cal's voice on speaker and let out a low, eager sound. The clue was small, but it was an external foothold we'd been waiting for. We walked the creek bank under pale Thursday sun. The water was clear enough to show smooth stones, and the air smelled of wet leaves and cold iron. Cal pointed to black scuffs on a sapling and a sliver of tire lodged in the mud. Rook sniffed it, then looked up at me and back to the woods, pressing forward with a deliberate pull. I felt the first shift in my own doubt and the first real movement in the case. Cal nodded once, satisfied. At lunch, we stopped at the diner on Main Street. The waitress asked if the rumours were true and slid Rook a bowl of water without being asked. 2 older men at the counter fell silent when Elena mentioned the tire had been there for 2 years. Their quiet shock said more than any speech. I realised the town had been holding this worry in its chest, waiting for someone to claim it with competence and care. Rook watched them, unblinking. Later that day, the school superintendent emailed me requesting a short safety briefing for bus drivers because of the deer sightings. The word briefing made everything feel official. I drafted notes while Rook lay beside the desk, his head resting on my boot. His presence was calm, but his eyes were bright and fixed on the door. The message was clear. He wanted action, not sympathy. Before someone got hurt, the clock ticked louder than usual. On Friday evening, a light snow mix began earlier than forecast. Elena called to say the state vet could meet us at dawn with sedation supplies if we could pinpoint the buck. I looked at the radar and thought about slick roads and panicked drivers. Rook nosed my glove, then stood by the door with a quiet insistence. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was simply the moment I stopped stalling and started trusting my dog's moral compass. We set the plan. Cal would lead us to the creek corridor. Elena would coordinate with the vet, and I would run point with Rook. Before we left the station, my captain signed a special authorization for multi-agency support, an uncommon paper for an uncommon animal. The printer whirred in the empty office. Rook sat beside it as the form came out, tail sweeping the floor in slow arcs. It felt like hope, but still fragile and easily lost. Saturday morning began with a community safety meeting in the church basement, the kind with folding chairs and coffee in foam cups. The superintendent, a few bus drivers, and half a dozen retirees showed up because the radio had made the tyre buck sound like a moving hazard. Rook sat at my side in his harness, calm but alert. When I explained our plan with the state, the room fell into a respectful silence that felt like the town handing us its trust. After the meeting, a local news photographer asked for a quick shot of Rook beside my cruiser. I almost refused, then remembered that visibility could keep people off the road during the capture. Rook held a steady sit for the camera, but the moment the lens lowered, he angled his body toward the forest. Ears pricked. Elena murmured that the buck had been spotted at dawn again, limping closer to the asphalt, and that our window might be shrinking. By noon, the weather shifted. Thick clouds rolled over the ridge, and the wind had that flat, metallic smell that usually means sleep. The state vet, Dr. Moore, called to warn that tranquilizing in unstable weather could be risky. We agreed to proceed only if the deer entered a controlled zone. Rook paced the garage, then stopped in front of my patrol boots, refusing to settle even when I gave the command. A quiet defiance that sharpened my resolve. Cal met us at the creek trailhead with a thermos of black coffee and a face lined by too many winters. He pointed to fresh tracks crossing the mud and said the buck had been there less than an hour earlier. Rook lowered his nose and began a tight, purposeful search pattern, tail rigid. His arthritis didn't slow him. It looked, for the first time in months, like he had been waiting for exactly this kind of meaningful work. We moved quietly through the trees while the wind rose. A small group of volunteers, kept well back at the access road, waited with orange vests and walkie-talkies. Their presence made me nervous, but it also underscored how wide this story had spread. Rook checked back with me every few yards, then pushed ahead again, as if he were balancing discipline with urgency. I reminded everyone that a safe rescue mattered more than a dramatic one. The first near accident came without drama. Only a sudden screech of brakes ahead. A delivery van swerved to avoid a doe that darted across the road. The driver stepped out, shaking, and the volunteers murmured prayers. Rook lunged once, then froze, staring down the asphalt. His body language said the same thing my own fear did. The buck would try to cross here too, and it could take one bad second to change everything. Elena radioed that a teenager had just uploaded a video of the tire buck feeding in a ditch a mile south of us. The clip was shaky but clear enough to show the tire riding lower on the neck, pressed against swollen fur. Dr. Moore changed course to meet us on County Road 6. Rook heard the radio and began pulling toward the road with a determination that bordered on refusal. I loosened the leash and let him lead. The tires on my own cruiser hissed on the wet shoulder. When we reached the shoulder, I saw the county SUV already parked with lights on low flash. A safety perimeter in a world that was getting slick. The golden hour light filtered through fast-moving clouds, turning the forest edges bronze. Rook positioned himself in front of me, not in a protective posture, but in a guiding one. He wanted me to follow his line of sight into the trees, and for once I didn't question his intuition. Over the next 20 minutes, Rook repeated a pattern I hadn't seen since his prime. He advanced 3 steps, paused, sniffed the wind, then back to my knee as if asking permission to try again. I tried to leash him tighter. He resisted without aggression, simply planting his paws. The message was unmistakable. This was not a normal call to clear and forget. He was telling me the deer was near and tired. The sleet tasted like iron on my lips. The wind brought sleet, faint at first, then sharper. Dr. Moore arrived with Elena, and the news photographer trailed behind them, keeping respectful distance. A small cluster of townspeople had gathered near their vehicles, quiet and worried, hands tucked into coat pockets. Rook stayed at my heel, steady in the noise. If we failed, Maple Ridge would feel that failure as a community, not just as a footnote in my report or a sad headline. Suddenly Cal raised his hand. Ahead, in the widening gap between trees and roadway, a young buck emerged, head low, antlers wide and majestic against the grey sky. A small rubber tire hung loosely around his neck, black against tawny fur. The deer looked exhausted, eyes soft and sad. Rook went still, then stepped forward a half pace, refusing to take his gaze off the animal, as if he were anchoring the buck to the moment. I could hear engines idling and the faint click of a camera shutter, but the road itself felt suspended. The buck stood in the middle of the lane as sleet touched his coat. Rook moved ahead of me as if he understood the urgency of the moment better than any human plan. I lifted my hand to signal the crowd to stay back. We had found him at last. But the hardest part was about to begin, and my heart kept counting seconds. Dr. Moore spoke in a low voice, explaining the plan to the small crowd that had formed behind the safety cones. 2 state troopers kept traffic stopped at either end of the curve. The news photographer filmed quietly from the shoulder, careful not to spook the buck. The public stage was here, on wet asphalt, with my town watching in a hush that felt like a prayer. Rook stood at my left knee, trembling with focus, but not fear. The buck took a slow step, then another, as if each movement had to negotiate with the tire that had lived on his neck for 2 years. The rubber ring was scuffed and stretched, hanging loosely now, but still limiting his swallow and breathing. He lowered his head, soft eyes catching the last sunlight breaking through the clouds. Rook eased forward, ears straight, and I let him, trusting his calm to set the tone for everyone watching. Elena and Cal fanned out to the tree line with blankets and a portable screen. Dr. Moore prepared a tranquilizer dart, checking the dosage twice and adjusting for the buck's weight. Someone from the church group offered to hold a flashlight even though the light was still golden. The buck flicked an ear at the voices but did not bolt. I realized he was too tired to run, and that our window was both precious and fragile in this shifting weather. Rook waited beside my leg. Rook stepped onto the road ahead of me, placing himself between the deer and the cluster of vehicles. It was not a command it taught him. It was judgment. He held still, breathing slow, his body language saying safety instead of chase. The buck looked at him, then at the flashing red and blue lights behind us, then back at Rook. In that quiet exchange, the town and the system seemed to hold one shared breath. I felt my own voice soften. Dr. Moore fired the dart cleanly into the buck's shoulder. The sound was a soft pop, almost swallowed by the wind. We waited, counting time by the deer's blinking eyes and the way his legs trembled. Rook sat the moment I gave the hand signal, his gaze never leaving the animal. He was the anchor we all needed, keeping the scene from tipping into panic while the sleet finally began to thin. Dr. Moore nodded to me when the minute mark passed, when the buck finally sank to his knees. We moved with practiced gentleness. Elena slid the portable screen to block the view from the road, more for dignity than necessity. Cal checked the antlers and murmured that the animal was younger than we'd imagined, still growing into his strength. I stroked Rook's shoulder to keep him steady. The camera captured our careful choreography, but the heart of it was quiet respect. The tire was smaller than I expected, a child's ATV tire or a scrap from a farm trailer. It had likely slipped over the buck's head when his antlers were still modest, then tightened as he matured. Dr. Moore cut the rubber with heavy shears, working slowly to avoid the fur and skin beneath. Rook leaned in to sniff, then stepped back, as if acknowledging that this part was human work and that his job was to keep the air calm. As the tire came free, a collective exhale rose from behind the cones. a woman I recognized from the diner wiped her eyes without embarrassment. One of my younger officers whispered, "Good boy," and meant Rook as much as the deer. The buck's neck was raw but not open. The damage mostly pressure and swelling. Dr. Moore applied a soothing gel and said the prognosis was good if we could keep him stress-free for the next hour. Rook repeated his strange new pattern, circling once and then lying down beside the sedated buck at a respectful distance. It was the same protective calm head shown with lost children and frightened seniors. Watching him, I understood the meaning of his earlier refusal. He wasn't chasing a headline. He was guarding a life that had been invisible to our systems for too long, and teaching the rest of us how to move gently. When the sedative began to lighten, we cleared the road and backed away. The buck lifted his head, tested the air, and swallowed without the rubber's drag. His ears rotated toward the forest, and his legs found their strength again. Rook rose with me, and for a moment the two animals stood parallel, one domestic, one wild, both shaped by endurance. The flashing lights reflected off wet leaves like scattered stars along the ditch. The buck took 3 careful steps toward the trees, then paused to look back. I know that's a risky thing to interpret, but the stillness felt like acknowledgement. Rook did not move to follow. He simply watched until the deer disappeared into green shadow. A cheer would have been wrong here. The town offered something better. Quiet respect. A few soft claps. A hand on my shoulder. And the sense that we had done something decent together. Later, at the station, the chief called me into his office with the local news clip already playing on his laptop. He said the story had travelled beyond county lines and that Rook's calm presence had been the difference between chaos and care. I signed the final incident report with a hand that shook from relief. For the first time in weeks, Rook rested his head on my knee and sighed, as if a long-held promise had finally been kept. 2 weeks later, a crisp Sunday sun returned to Maple Ridge, and the roads dried into their familiar grey. The local paper ran a follow-up piece with a still image of Rook standing ahead of me on the forest road. They called him the dog who wouldn't look away. I clipped the article for my daughter and taped a copy to the break room fridge. Rook sniffed the ink, then chose a nap in the warm patch of light by the kitchen door. Elena emailed a brief update from trail cameras. The buck had been seen near the creek without the tire, moving with a smoother rhythm and feeding longer before retreating. The photos showed a faint mark on his neck, but his posture was higher, less burdened. I printed the images and pinned them on the station board. Rook sat beside me, ears relaxed, as if satisfied with proof that the story continued beyond our reach. The town's gratitude arrived in small ways. A box of homemade cookies appeared at the front desk with a note that simply said, "For Rook." the high school art class sent a hand-drawn card showing a deer and a police dog under golden trees. During a quiet shift, I read the messages aloud to Elena and the rookies. Rook wagged once, then leaned his shoulder into my leg, preferring presents over celebration. The station smelled of sugar and winter coats. I gave the bus driver a briefing that the superintendent had requested, but this time the mood was lighter. People asked practical questions about wildlife corridors and safe speeds instead of rumour and blame. Cal attended and spoke about preventing discarded tyres and wire in the woods. The external event felt like a civic pivot. Rook lay at my feet, calm, the living reminder that compassion could have procedure attached to it. At home, our routines changed by a fraction. Rook no longer hovered over the wildlife drawer. Instead, he brought me his old training tug in the evenings, inviting play that was gentle and short. I called the vet to schedule his retirement exam for the end of the month. The date sounded like a door closing, but also like relief. Rook listened to the call and rested his chin on my shoe, as if to say he was ready. His tail thumped once, slow and sure. One late afternoon, we drove the same forest road for a quiet patrol. Not because we had to, but because the place had become part of our shared map. The light was golden again, the way it had been during the rescue. We did not see the buck, but we saw fresh tracks crossing safely into cover near the creek. Rook paused, sniffed the air, and then turned back to the cruiser without needing my cue, content to let the wild stay wild. That night I set 2 bowls of water on the porch, a small ritual that felt half practical and half symbolic. The air was cool, and the stars were clear over the grain silos. Rook settled beside my chair, his breathing steady. I scratched the white hairs now appearing on his muzzle and felt the county's quietness settle into something kinder. For the first time in months, the unease was replaced by a simple, earned calm we could both recognize. The retirement exam came back better than I expected. Mild arthritis, stable heart, a weight that the vet called ideal for his age. The report was an external piece of paper that felt like permission to slow down without guilt. I brought Rook to the river trail afterward, and we walked under bare branches and pale sun. He moved with dignity, no longer a machine of duty, but still unmistakably my partner and my daily compass. The chief hosted a small canine appreciation ceremony in the town hall, with coffee, a folded flag, and a few words that stayed honest instead of sentimental. Elena presented photos from the rescue, and Cal sat in the front row with his hat in his hands. When the applause started, Rook stood, looked around calmly, then leaned into my leg. The room's respect was quiet and deep, the way older towns say thank you without fuss. In the weeks that followed, the tire buck became a kind of local shorthand for what can happen when people pay attention sooner. The county added a wildlife hotline poster at the post office and hardware store. School kids collected discarded fishing line and rubber along the creek as a service project. I watched Rook observe them from the cruiser window. Ears relaxed, as if he understood that his stubborn focus had widened the circle of care. One afternoon, Elena sent a final trail camera image. The buck stood at the edge of a meadow, neck thick and clean, antlers catching late light. The marks from the tire were faint now. I printed the photo and placed it beside the letter from the Blizzard rescue years ago. 2 different lives saved in different ways, both tied to one dog's refusal to accept quiet suffering. Rook sniffed the frame and then settled at my feet. On my last official day, I drove home before sunset and left the radio off. The house was warm, and the smell of anise peach preserves lingered from a jar shed dropped off for luck. Rook followed me onto the porch and sat close enough that our shoulders touched. The woods beyond town were calm, holding their own stories without our interference. I rested my hand on his collar and whispered, "I'm glad we found each other. I'm not alone anymore." If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.